He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He cut deep, and yet I just undercut him. Hello everybody, I'm KC and welcome to an edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. And the inaugural season for the modern great detective comes to a close with The Great Game. Moriarty finally steps out of the shadows and makes his move, taking random hostages from throughout London to prompt Sherlock to solve time-sensitive cases. Sherlock plays along, hoping this will finally lead him face to face with this master criminal. I'm gonna be upfront about this. The Great Game is my favorite episode of Sherlock. It's probably not the best, but it's the most appealing and engaging to me. There isn't a scene I don't enjoy, a case I don't find enticing, a conflict I don't find gripping. And as much as I was liking Sherlock, I think this was the story that made me love it and had me hope that there would be many more adventures in the future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a closer look at this season 1 finale. Right up front, I love how this episode stands out and escalates the threat from what we've seen up to this point. Unlike the previous episodes, which revolved around one big case, Moriarty sets up a, great game of several smaller cases for Sherlock to take on, which works on several levels. Showing Moriarty's reach, not just in what he gets involved in, since we later find out that all the people responsible for these crimes got in touch with Moriarty, though not directly, but how much he's willing to throw under the bus and how it doesn't seem to faze him at all. And quick side note, the performances from the hostages are incredible. They really make you feel like their lives are on the line. Frankly, it's chilling, giving Moriarty an absolutely frightening presence before we ever even see him. And how this episode is a compilation of smaller cases that are connected by a greater thread. Most of them are original cases not inspired by the books, which is weird to me, but it's season 1 so I get it. But it still feels like an homage to the books by focusing on multiple cases that wouldn't sustain a full episode of Sherlock, but made up a majority of the Holmes library. Most Sherlock Holmes stories are barely 20 pages long, so in a way, this felt much more true to the source material. Speaking of the source material, this segment seems to come earlier with each installment, but trust me, it's essential this time. While the investigations and larger narrative of The Great Game is very much original to Sherlock, the episode is seasoned with an abundance of references to the original stories that really flows what the one this episode wants to tell. The first proper scene is one of my favorites in the series because it's full of callbacks. Sherlock shooting at the wall is another detail of Baker Street described in the Musgrave Ritual, though in the story it was a symbol of Queen and country, and here it's a smiley face. Bit of a downgrade, I will admit. The dialogue in this scene references a line from the Bruce Partington plans that always stuck out to me.
What's gone into the criminal classes? Good job I'm not one of them.
And that Sherlock doesn't know that Earth goes around the sun, which was something Watson found out about the detective in A Study in Scarlet, which, as the episode points out, is even more outrageous in 2010 than it was in the 1880s. But it's used to illustrate how Sherlock only remembers things he deems important to his work. In the books, Holmes compares his mind to an attic to only fill with the right furnishing, but in Sherlock, he compares it to a hard drive, which to me is a way better analogy, even if the empty attic method is apparently a thing thanks to that old quote. This is also the first time we hear about John writing up his cases with Sherlock, except instead of being in a short story magazine, it's on his blog, which is another great update and a good payoff to when it was set up back in A Study in Pink. We all knew where that was going, but it's nice to hear it mentioned. It also gives way to another line where Sherlock says he'd be lost without his blogger, a rewrite of a line from A Scandal of Bohemia where Holmes says, "I'd be lost without my Boswell," that I thought was cute. Boswell was a biographer, if you didn't know. Like I didn't when I read this when I was 16. Clearly online schooling failed me. Another clever update is Sherlock's Homeless Network, a reinterpretation of the Baker Street Irregulars, a group of street boys Holmes used to gather information around the city. But changing that to a bunch of street adults was probably for the best here. The phone Moriarty gives Sherlock to contact him makes 5 beeps when he first receives it. Sherlock calls them pips, which he interprets as a warning, like the one used in the 5 orange pips. This one I thought was a bit of a stretch, but this is apparently a thing in England called the Greenwich Time Signal, or PIPS. So, okay, that's pretty clever. And these are kind of small, but still worth mentioning. During one of the investigations, Sherlock quotes one of his most famous sayings while being agitated at Lestrade from A Scandal in Bohemia.
I don't see. You do see, you just don't observe.
And to Molly about her relationship that is pulled from a comment he made at Watson, also from A Scandal in Bohemia. Look, A Scandal in Bohemia has a lot of great lines, but the latter felt kind of meaner when said to Molly. Also during that scene, Sherlock asked for John to apply his methods to an item related to a case they're working on in a way that's very similar to the Blue Carbuncle, one of my personal favorite stories and one of my favorite scenes from it. This episode keeps getting more and more points. This is also the first appearance of Sherlock's violin, and Mycroft returns to recruit Sherlock for a case retrieving the Bruce Partington plans, the only one of the many cases in this episode directly ripped from the pages of the original stories, and it's a pretty faithful reimagining of an underrated tale. But do trains actually travel that closely to houses in the UK? That seems weird. As you can tell from just how long this segment is this time, The Great Game has allusions to Sherlock Holmes stories across the board, from one-off lines to larger pieces of the show's universe. To me, it showed that Sherlock could still stay true to the source material while telling its own story. As an aside, I really enjoyed Mycroft's appearance here. Now that he's no longer shrouded in mystery, we can look at Mycroft the entire time for what he is. An important, stuffy member of the government who can't even convince his little brother to take a case. Their relationship is definitely more antagonistic than it was in the whole 2 stories Mycroft featured in, but it's usually pretty funny to watch these 2 incredible minds bicker the same way any other siblings would. I also get a kick out of how amused Sherlock is at John's dry remarks towards Mycroft. Getting back to the crime work, the deduction and investigation scenes are deeply engaging, especially since John has become more involved with the actual casework and is a more active part of the process. The energy from the actors and the progression and tension that the script creates make sure there's never a dull moment. Nice to have Lestrade back too. Please, Rupert Graves, never leave again. I also think Mark Gatiss is a fan of mythology because there's a lot of references to mythology and folklore across multiple cultures throughout these cases. With a great script, that means the dialogue is once again delightful. From waxing poetic to quick quips, from rattling off deductions to slowing down for moral confrontations, I can quote this episode more than any other because there are so many incredible ones. I thought about playing my favorites, but frankly we might be here for a while, and there's still a lot more episode to talk about. McGinnon is back in the director's chair this time, and because of that, the episode is visually striking. Most of my compliments towards McGinnon's work in his study in pink to make Sherlock stand out visually apply to this episode as well. My only major issue with the direction this time around is the confrontation with the golem at the planetarium. There are some cool atmospheric shots, but the scratching of the recording and the flashing projection really can get disorienting. It's a weak needle in a very impressive haystack. So before we get into the deeper stuff, I'm gonna gush about a few more smaller things I really liked, particularly when it comes to watching Sherlock investigate multiple cases. From some cases showing more of Sherlock's talents as a chemist, to Sherlock implementing various disguises, from the traditional but low effort of a different outfit, to acting again to get information. To his credit, it worked. One of my favorites though is Sherlock browsing fan forums for information on a victim who was a TV personality. There's just something so funny about that to me. But my absolute favorite part of the investigations in this episode is the revelation that comes with the very first case.
Carl Powers, John. What is it? Extravagant.
Getting a really interesting look into that first spark that led Sherlock to crime solving, an origin that I believe is unique to this series. But it goes deeper. The death of Carl Powers is the only one that Moriarty was personally responsible for from back when he was younger, meaning Sherlock and Moriarty started on the path that led them to confront each other in possibly the exact same place.
I know. Right?
It's something they don't really go any deeper with, but it's quite the connection. It's also a sign of just how much of a fan Moriarty really is of Sherlock. Not only with the shoes, but the fact that they were placed in the flat right below his, and that he's communicating with him all this time through a pink cell phone.
What, from a study in pink?
Exactly. Thank you, Inspector. This game challenges Sherlock on a much more personal level than any other case in the series up to this point, and the Great Game in general gives us much more insight into Sherlock as a character. The opening scene gives us a look at Sherlock when he doesn't have a case to occupy his mind, how he finds ordinary things generally uninteresting if he can't use it for his work, and how he becomes irritable and almost depressed when he doesn't have something to solve, which is just as important a part of the character as the clever gentleman, so I'm glad they're using it. However, just because he tends to find everyday things uninteresting and most of his knowledge is dedicated to honing his self-critic craft, doesn't mean he doesn't find pleasure in things that don't involve deduction. He plays the violin after all, and there's a small moment where Sherlock admires the beauty of the stars he once called unimportant. But once Moriarty gives Sherlock all these cases, he's intrigued. Maybe a little too intrigued. Sherlock finds the challenge of these cases absolutely invigorating in a way that pretty much everyone around him, especially John, feels is inappropriate given the situation. John is concerned about the hostages, while Sherlock is reveling in the work presented to him and how interesting he finds it. Moriarty even teases him once or twice about how much he's enjoying all this, finding a criminal who can think on his level. While Sherlock had looked at the great detective's lack of social skills and eccentricity when it comes to his dedication to his work, this is the first time the show really looks at the ethics of Sherlock's work and if he's doing it for what most would believe are the right reasons. It's the same thing that was touched on with Jeff Hope in A Study in Pink. The thrill of something that could challenge Sherlock and proving he can outsmart it clouds everything else. And this comes to the surface with John. There are several moments of John pondering if Sherlock is enjoying battling someone who might be just as clever as him at the expense of the innocent people being put in danger, thinking of the victims first at all times. All this eventually erupts when one of the victims, an old blind woman no less, is killed because she tried to give information about Moriarty. When Sherlock seems irritated that it happened, even though he solved the case, John kinda loses it.
There are lives at stake, Sherlock. You care about that at all?
Well, caring about them helps save them.
Nope.
Then I'll continue not to make that mistake.
And you find that easy, do you?
Yes, very.
This exchange is quite possibly the most important revelation and insight of Sherlock's character, but I don't think I can properly convey why until we get to some later developments in the series. So just keep it in the back of your mind, pals, for now. It'll be a while, but trust me, we'll come back to this. But there's still a couple of things we can discuss about the scene. For one, I think this is the first time for John where the rose-colored glasses are off. In A Study in Pink, he found Sherlock's work exciting. In The Blind Banker, he found rooming with Sherlock exhausting and even frustrating, but he was still more than willing to help him with his case. And while he's willing to do that here as well, even going off on his own from time to time, it's the lack of compassion towards the ones getting hurt that finally gets to him. And I gotta hand it to Freeman here. He truly lets it all out in very few words, like a man who's full of both anger and resignation. But while Sherlock might be incredibly insensitive, as a soldier and a doctor, I think John's also frustrated because he knows that, on some level, Sherlock is right. Caring about these people won't save them. Focusing on the problem at hand will. Something Sherlock is not shy to remind John of over the course of this insane journey. Especially when, after that outburst, John becomes reluctant to help him with the next case, and Sherlock calls him out on that while getting back to the work that will help the next victim. I'm not saying Sherlock should be calling murder cases elegant and that John shouldn't find that disrespectful. I'm just saying this whole thing isn't exactly black and white, which is what makes it so great. Usually the differences between these two balance each other out for the better, but this is the first time where they conflict, and may force them to look at the other and themselves a bit differently. Let's just say this discussion isn't over. Despite this argument, John keeps helping Sherlock through the Bruce Partington case, and by that point, it seems like Moriarty's trail of cases has gone cold. But I'm sorry, John should have realized something was off the moment Sherlock offered to get groceries. This brings us to the big climax, the play where Sherlock makes his move to confront the Napoleon of crime face to face. But it turns out that he was still one step ahead of the great detective. Oh, don't worry guys, John isn't Moriarty. He's just his latest hostage and has massive explosives strapped to his chest under a hideous coat. Whew, that's a relief. For a second there I was worried. I don't remember being fooled by this, but I'd be very curious if anyone out there was. No, my moment of disbelief came from the actual reveal of James Moriarty.
I told you my call.
What the heck is that?
Jim Moriarty. Hi.
No, I'm sorry, but no. What were they thinking here? Look, I know it took me a hot second to warm up to Cumberbatch as Sherlock, and I said that the casting in the show gets the characters, even if they don't look like they traditionally do, but how could they get this one this wrong? I'm supposed to believe that this guy is the most feared criminal possibly on the planet? In what universe is this scrawny little dweeb supposed to be threatening?
People have died.
That's what people do!
Oh my god, this works. Once again, within seconds, the visual departure from how Moriarty is traditionally portrayed was compensated for by pure, chilling, pants-crapping terror. Andrew Scott was absolutely perfect casting. He makes literally everything Moriarty says feel incredibly unsettling and that he's enjoying it immensely. Every single line and movement from Scott is theatrically disturbing. It makes my skin crawl, and I love it. I still don't know why he bothered disguising himself as Molly's boyfriend though. Maybe it was to gain information on Sherlock, but it was more likely just some way to mess with him in a bizarre way. This confrontation is to this day my favorite scene in Sherlock. These two facing off with each other is unbelievably tense. Cumberbatch's delivery is calm but determined, and Scott is just having way too much fun making sure nobody watching sleeps tonight. And again, the tension is incredible. The location of the pool is really creepy in a way I wouldn't expect, and the looming threat of someone pulling a trigger or whatever Moriarty has got up his sleeves keeps you on the edge of your seat without having to draw too much attention to those threats. Oh, and then John does this.
Sherlock, run!
You gotta love the little gestures, even in a big story like this. John may have had enough of Sherlock many times during this whole ordeal, but he's still his friend, and willing to go the extra mile to save his ass. It didn't work this time, but it's nice that he tried. A for effort, Watson. As we get closer to the credits, the confrontation also has an ominous air to it. A level of uncertainty that just because Sherlock managed to come face to face with this mysterious consulting criminal doesn't mean the fight is over. Far from it. And Moriarty makes sure he knows that, and the lengths he's ready to go to keep Sherlock from interfering with his work. And in the end, Moriarty just leaves, walks off free. We all may have known that this would by no means be the last time we'd see him, but that's not what Sherlock was thinking about, because this is the very first thing he does after he's sure Moriarty is gone.
All right. Are you all right?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Sherlock.
It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. For the one and only time, I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. That's a pair of quotes from the Sherlock Holmes story, The Three Garridebs. The standout moment is Holmes worrying about Watson when he was shot. Watson makes that okay, but he always remembers this moment, where the cold, calculating presence melted away out of concern for his friend. For so long, I wanted to see this recreated in Sherlock, but watching the show again, I realized this is that moment. It's not under the same circumstances, but it's very similar in what it says about Sherlock. In an episode that's all about observing Sherlock's attitude towards these life or death situations, with John questioning if he really cares about the victims, this moment shows that he at least cares about one, his partner, his flatmate, his friend, his one true friend. It's quite possibly the culmination of building these two into the iconic duo we all know so well, and an excellent example of friendship to wrap this debut season of...
Sorry, boys! I'm so changeable!
Oh, right, we're not done here. Yes, the very last moments of season 1 contain an extra bit of conflict between these two great minds. A stalemate of who will make it out of this community pool alive. Moriarty has his men ready to shoot, Sherlock's ready to shoot as well, but it's something else. They both quote possibly the best exchange from their confrontation in The Final Problem.
Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind.
Probably my answer has crossed yours.
And then...
the show like that, I have to know what happens!
Yeah, that was extremely infuriating, especially considering that season 2 was not confirmed when this episode aired. Well, it wouldn't be long until we saw how this resolved. Sherlock wasn't known for long hiatuses. But before we concern ourselves with season 2, let me conclude my thoughts on season 1. Overall, The Great Game is so flipping good. I love this episode. I've probably watched it more than any other in the series, and it has me fully invested every time. It had me on the edge of my seat when I watched it in parts online back in 2010, and I was just as invested when I saw it months later when it played on Masterpiece Mystery here in the US. The format delivers a great amount of variety that always keeps you invested. The production is both grounded and cinematic. The casework is incredibly suspenseful and engaging. The performances continue to amaze. The dialogue is incredible. The book-related callbacks are blended into the modern setting expertly, and this proper debut for Moriarty shattered my expectations in every way. It's clever, it's funny, it's dramatic, it's kinda terrifying, and it gives so much but leaves you begging for more. Especially with that cliffhanger. Like, what the heck? Like I said at the beginning of this review, I liked Sherlock before this episode, but this Great Game is where I think I officially loved it. It's everything I love about the show. What few missteps there are, I can forgive easily because the strides it takes are so long and so well executed. The first season of Sherlock impressed me in so many ways, and when I heard season 2 was finally on the way, I couldn't wait to see what it had to offer. And we'll talk about that next time in A Scandal in Belgravia. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.